recording has started. So, hello everyone. My name is Gervais Johnson, but I go by Jay Johnson. I'm here in San Francisco. I'm one of the co-founders and leaders of this Enterprise Agile meetup. I think we're on our fourth year or something. Ron and Gopal helped me do this a lot. I could not do that without their help. They're significant individuals to help me do through this and know a lot of cool people. So I welcome them and thank them for doing this over the years. So the purpose of our meetup is to talk about things that apply to large companies. We call it Enterprise Agile, but what we mean by that is, complex organizations, large companies that have to deal with how do I become an Agile enterprise, how do I implement Agile, all that cool stuff. So we talk about a lot of different topics that of interest. And of course, a lot of these things can be applied to smaller companies, right? I don't know if a lot of this can be applied to startups, Ron and Gopal, but I'm sure some of it can be.
Not the safe part.
Not to, but that's the purpose of our meetup, is to talk about these fundamental challenges that we have to implement Agile in large organizations. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ron, and Ron is going to introduce our speaker, and then our speaker is going to take it away. Go, Ron.
So I'll start by saying Jay and I met each other at a meetup. And I think it was Agile coaching circles. I think that was the meetup we met at originally.
Right.
Kevin and I met each other at a meetup. In fact, it was his office. Kevin had volunteered Avvo for the Beyond Agile meetup. It was a month. This is in Seattle, and it was a month after I had been the speaker at Beyond Agile. And I got introduced, and I think I introduced myself actually to Kevin. I got introduced to that month's speaker and discovered he was not quite my daughter's teacher at her high school in San Francisco, but close. He was there at the same time. And then I met Kevin, and I was chatting with him and discovered he had been at Spotify. And I thought, I'm going to ask a clever question. Spotify says never use Spotify's methodology anywhere. So I said, so Kevin, now that you're at Avvo, are you using Spotify's methodology? He said, no. And I said, okay, so good. So tell me what you're doing. And then he promptly described what to me is Spotify's methodology, except he changed all the words, just like Nieberg did, from team to squad to now Kevin's got something else. So he was clearly picking up and carrying the ball, but carrying the ball carefully. And I thought, wow, and as we were thinking through who would we like to hear from? I've had interesting conversations with Kevin multiple times, and I thought, well, if I can get him talking about what he's taken away from Spotify, what lessons he learned there, what he observed there, what worked and what didn't work, and what he's using subsequently. And so now this is his third CTO role since, correct me if I'm wrong, Kevin, but I think it's your third CTO role since being at Spotify.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to let you go
fourth, actually, but yeah.
Okay, great. I'll let you go from there.
Thank you. Thanks, Ron. I've been watching and joining some of the Enterprise Agile San Francisco meetups over the last year. I feel very privileged and honored to be part of this series, because there's been people I know and people I know of that have been part of this, that have been it's great to be part of this. So, yep. I'm going to share my screen. I have some slides here. So give me 1 second to do that. And then, okay, so hopefully you should be seeing those slides. I lost video, so you got to let me know verbally.
We can see your slides, Kevin.
Excellent. Great. Okay. So Yeah, as Ron said, I joined Spotify in 2013, so a few months after the white paper that Henrik Nieberg and Anders Iversen published came out. In fact, when I was interviewing originally at Spotify, I didn't know, like, no one knew what the Spotify model was at that point, and neither did I. I had no idea. I just thought I was interviewing for a streaming music company. And when they sent me to prepare for my in-person interviews in Stockholm, when they sent me that white paper, it went from, oh, this is kind of interesting, it might be a fun thing, to, oh my goodness, what they're doing is so much what I've been trying to build. At the time, I was a director at Adobe, and I had been at Adobe for 9 years, but had been really trying to figure out how to scale autonomous teams and do that in a, build an agile organization. And we've been trying some ideas in my organization, and I read what Spotify was doing, and I'd seen, oh, they'd just taken what I was playing with and taken it to another whole level. So especially once I met people there and kind of understood, no, this wasn't just a thought experiment, they were actually doing this. That went from oh, this might be kind of interesting, to maybe work in Europe for a little bit, and I spent some time in streaming media, so that would be fun, to, I have to work here, I have to see what this is like. So I was there for 3 years. I joined, as I said, in the spring of 2013. I was there till kind of summer of 2016. That was a time of tremendous growth for Spotify. When I joined Spotify, one of the reasons I was about Spotify was they were just one of many streaming music services in 2013. But by 2016, they were now the predominant music streaming service. Apple Music had launched, and we kept ourselves innovating faster than Apple. That was a really scary time for us. I talk about that in a talk. Um, and that whole experience, I got to see how this model scaled, how this worked, and really live in it, and participate in it and help it evolve. So I was really there at a very privileged time, and I learned a tremendous amount. So this talk is really about those things that Ron mentioned. Well, I would say, yeah, so you'll see how I've adapted those ideas, and you can tell me how much I just rename things and how much I kind of took some of the core ideas and just applied them in new ways. So this talk is called Steal from the Best. Sorry, I gotta put my screen into active so that I can flip through my slides. This talk is not about the Spotify model, only because if I do that, if I talked about the Spotify model, experience tells me that I would then spend the whole time talking about the Spotify model, because people have lots and lots of questions about it. I am very happy to take questions about kind of specific things of the Spotify model at the end, and should be a lot of time for questions. But I'm going to cover it very, very briefly at a very quick pace so that I can sort of move on from that. There are plenty of great talks. There's the white paper that Henrik and Anders did. There's the videos that I even helped Henrik with later that people know. There's talks I've given when I still worked at Spotify about the Spotify model. There's blog posts, including one I wrote. I've written several blog posts when I worked there, including one actually, Ron, called "Don't Do the Spotify Model," telling people not to copy the Spotify model for various reasons that I go into. So there's lots of references around that. I'm very happy to take questions at the end, but I'm going to cover it very quickly to move on from there, because it's been 5 years since I worked there. So the core of the Spotify model is it's an autonomous team, a true agile autonomous team model designed to scale. To Ron's point, like, we came up with new names for everything, and for those of you who are part of like agile transformations or building kind of new agile team models, that's a very, very smart branding thing to do. I can tell you companies that I've talked to that did copy the Spotify model and left our names intact. No one believes everyone just says, well, you're just copying Spotify because you're using Squad or Guild or Tribe or whatever, even though they maybe have done some new innovation. So people who are doing stuff, I always tell them, yeah, come up with new names for everything. Our names were horrible, but they were different. So, and they have stuck. at the critical part of this was that it was true autonomy. Lots of companies talk about, oh, we build autonomous teams, but when you dig below the surface, those teams either aren't fully staffed in order to execute independently, or they don't really have true decision-making capability within the team, or even they have to petition for kind of servers or shared other kinds of shared resources where they really aren't autonomous. They have dependencies outside the team. The Spotify model, the Spotify core, was a true autonomous team model. They had the complete freedom to act independently, and that meant they were staffed appropriately, so they had no dependencies on other teams for staffing. They had all the resources they would need to execute against their goals, and they had the ability to create and set and execute against their goals without having to ask for permission or get approval. The core of that was these teams. The core Spotify team was called a squad as opposed to a team. Otherwise, it would have been, you'll see there would have been teams, there were like 55 different kinds of teams. So having different names for each of them was actually a benefit, trying to differentiate between things like squads and chapters. So chapter leads were the line managers. They were generally functionally oriented. So if you're an iOS developer, you had a chapter lead who was an iOS developer, or if you're backend developer, similar. So you'd have things like iOS chapter lead, backend chapter lead, Agile chapter lead, Agile coach chapter lead, and they were usually in a squad, but they managed across the squads. So they would have all the people in their function across multiple teams. It was a matrix organization. So the teams of that kind of direct reporting relationship, those chapter leads managed a group called chapters. It was a different team structure. And those squads and chapters were part of a tribe. And I was originally hired as a tribe lead for the music player tribe. The music player tribe is kind of the first tribe at Spotify. So if of all the tribes, mine actually was probably the closest aligned to that white paper, that original white paper that Hendrik and Anders wrote. And we functioned, if you've ever read that white paper, we functioned kind of that way, very much that way. So again, this every member of my tribe was a member of at least 3 teams. They were a member of a squad, they were a member of a chapter, and they were a member of the tribe. An important part of this, again, is that your manager, if you were a developer or tester or whomever on the team, may have worked in your team and may not have. Those teams didn't have, those squads didn't have any squad leadership. There was no engineering manager or tech lead for the squad, which is important. Those were collaborative, collectively run teams. Each person had a responsibility, had their area, and worked together, as opposed to having somebody driving the team or somebody that was singularly responsible. In the Spotify model, me as tribe lead, I was the first point of responsibility. I was the first level of single ringable neck in kind of the old way of thinking about things. And I was managing a team initially of 50, later 175. But that was it. I was the first point of individual responsibility. Tribes were generally between 40 and 150 people. As I said, like they were designed to be big enough that there was kind of fluidity, and they were staffed pretty well. When I joined, my tribe was originally about, as I said, about 48 people. At about 150, thinking really in terms of Dunbar's number, the idea would be that everybody in a group that size should be able to at least kind of know each other. And that was by design. Everything in the Spotify model was by design. So that was an important part. So those were the kind of guidelines we used. And we eventually had tribes that grew past that point, including my own. And they really struggled at that point because of wanting to have this very, very flat hierarchy from me as, I reported to the CTO, the chapter leads reported to me, and the individuals reported to them. And that was about the depth of the hierarchy. And we didn't want it to get any deeper. But we were growing, that became a problem. So another important part of this was I didn't manage the product owners. I had a product peer that managed product managers or product owners. And I had a peer that was the that led user experience. The product management and user experience were separate hierarchies that were more kind of traditional structure. They overlaid across these really flat hierarchies. So that added a level of consistency around product direction, a level of consistency around UX. That kind of gave it a nice little spine on top of this much more sort of amorphous matrix structure that was the tribes. Collectively, we were called the trio. So if this is multiple tribes, each of the tribe would have a trio. If you were like from the infrastructure and operations where you maybe didn't have a user experience function, maybe it'd just be a couple of people, but that was more or less the way these worked. While one of the problems we had, because these teams were truly autonomous, they didn't need to speak to each other. Squads didn't ever need to coordinate, need to talk to each other, which was great for their autonomy. It wasn't really great for things like sharing best practices. So chapters helped achieve that, sharing information. You know, the tribe kind of did that within a tribe, but we had this problem of these autonomous teams not needing to speak to each other, and ideas and thoughts and kind of other things not moving between these pretty impermeable barriers. So another thing that they created was guilds. So guilds were either communities of practice. There was like the iOS developer guild and the backend developer guild and data engineering guild that were really, there's C++ developers guild that spanned all the tribes and all the squads. That helped create these kind of communities of practice that broke through some of these silos. But then there were also like very traditional kind of more club things where I was part of the photography guild in Stockholm. There was in Boston, they had like a whiskey tasting guild. So it was really just meant to find ways to create connections across these teams that could be very isolated and very kind of inward focused. Over time, as I said, we had a little trouble scaling. We were as flat as we possibly could be as the teams continued to grow. My tribe was now, as I said, I think about 160, something like that. My boss, who was a CTO, he had, I think we might have been up to 8 tribes at that point. We were getting to a point where we couldn't horizontally scale anymore. And this was a serious problem for us because we really wanted to be as flat as we possibly could. I think at this point, engineering might have been about 600-700 people. I forget. So we knew we had to make a change. I'll talk a little bit about some of the thought process and the way we would do things that was really important and different at Spotify from other companies I've been at. But eventually we needed some new structure. We tried lots and lots of different ways to avoid adding another layer of hierarchy. But in the end, we came back to, all right, that was kind of the next thing to do. We created something called alliances. I moved from being the music player tribe lead to being the consumer alliance lead. In consumer, I ran all the mobile, desktop, web clients. So basically, if you're using Spotify, the tool, the app or website or desktop app you use, I was also responsible, and I had been prior, also responsible for all the media. At that point, we were adding video, all the media ingestion, streaming, storage, metadata, all those aspects as well. So that was the Consumer Alliance. And I had a peer still on product and a peer on design. We were now the Alliance trio. So that is the sort of 6-7 minute version of the Spotify model. But more important than the model itself was, why was it created? So the model had very intense intent built into it. One thing that was critical was Spotify knew that they had to move fast. One of Daniel Ek, the founder's kind of early realizations that has made Spotify successful was that eventually he knew there would only be 2 or 3 streaming media companies, streaming music companies specifically. And he knew Apple was probably going to be one of them because at that point, Apple was already the world's largest music retailer. So he thought maybe be Apple, maybe be Amazon, maybe be Google, but Spotify, there might be room for one independent. And the way he knew that Spotify would stay ahead of these much bigger companies was just by moving faster. So an important part of why these autonomous teams were created was to make things go faster. Velocity was super important, velocity of innovation. So if you have a really true autonomous team, okay, well, they don't need they don't need to talk to anybody to make a decision. They're fully empowered to make a decision. So there are no decision-making bottlenecks. I said I came from Adobe. At Adobe, as a director, periodically, I would need approval to do something. I had a lot of autonomy, certainly a lot more than a lot of other companies Adobe's size had. But every once in a while, if I needed to do something, I would have to meet with the VP, which often meant I would need to meet with him. I'd have to book that weeks in advance. And sometimes it meant I had to fly to San Francisco to do it. So we didn't have that. They didn't need me to approve anything. If they did something that I wasn't happy about, it was up to me to find out about it, and then up to me to go talk to them and understand why they were doing it, because that was better. Maybe they go in a direction I'm not happy with as their single responsible person. Better for them to do that than it was for me to them have to get my approval on every decision, because that would have slowed them down. Similarly, they had no dependencies on other teams, as I've said. Like, that was a crucial part of this, which meant that they didn't have to do things like Scrum of Scrums. That didn't exist. Or even something like Scrum of Scrums, because they had no dependencies on other squads. Any squad had 0 dependencies, or as close to 0 as we could ever possibly make it, on any other team. And that was, again, by design. So they never had to synchronize against each other. And similarly, because they were fully resourced, they didn't have to schedule design or schedule test if those were separate teams. That was always resourced within the team, so that they had the full ability to do it themselves. And obviously, one of the reasons you create a lot of process in organizations is to kind of solve these problems of synchronization and decision making, and kind of iron out problems between teams. Well, if you don't have all those kind of problems, because each of those teams is working independently, there's not a lot of process. Spotify was, for an organization size, and I was there as it continued to grow, we had a surprisingly little amount of process within the organization. And again, by design, because that will tend to slow teams down to this kind of slowest team. It allowed us to do things like be very, very dynamic. As Spotify being a growing startup, you're always going to have short-term opportunity, like a time-bound opportunity, and you want to be able to be very flexible around that. We had a lot of flexibility within this model. I could spin up a new squad very quickly. Once a squad had achieved its goal, it could spin itself back down and distribute people into other squads. That was very easy within that model. Obviously, if you're a growing startup, you're worried about hiring, you're also worried about retaining. So you want people to be happy. So this kind of model of team ownership and a ton of autonomy, speaking to the sort of autonomy, mastery, and purpose, people had that. People had a huge sense of ownership over the team's work because they were part of the decision-making process, and that decision-making was all local. They had very little ever felt forced upon them, and they were very protective of that, almost to a fault. I think at sometimes they were very protective of their team autonomy. Because your chapter lead, if you're a developer or tester or whatever, because your chapter lead was not necessarily in your team and not managing your team, that meant that you could switch teams without switching your manager. And that was, again, by design, because that meant we had a ton of fluidity within a tribe. You could switch teams either for a particular reason, or because they need help, or or because you want to try something new. And that could be done without actually losing your manager, who is, ideally somebody caring about your own personal development and professional development and all those kinds of things. It's people, if you have a manager you like, oftentimes people stay in teams longer than they probably should, just because they don't want to lose their manager. And that helped to encourage their personal and professional growth. On the scale side, Spotify, and this is important to state, if you've read the blitzscaling book, Spotify's in it. Spotify was a blitzscaling company. Spotify was not a scale up. Spotify was not a static company. Spotify was growing incredibly fast. Again, by design. Daniel Ek understood they had to do that in order to be one of those final streaming music companies, as they are. So this model had to support an incredible amount of scale. We were doubling and tripling every year in the number of people on the teams. And one of the critical things, because I've been a leader at multiple scale ups since then, that's kind of been my sweet spot after Spotify, is I come in as a senior leader of these kind of scale up companies. The hardest thing when you're growing quickly is to maintain that culture, maintain the things that made you a unique company to begin with, that brought you success. This model was very much designed to help maintain that culture while growing very, very quickly. And again, absolutely thoughtfully done by design. And it gave us, as I mentioned, a lot of adaptability within each, because each team was autonomous, because each tribe was autonomous, later each alliance was autonomous. We had a tremendous amount of fluidity in the way we approached the set of problems we were working on, or our mission, that we could tailor the way we did things to our teams. Because I owned a lot of feature teams, because I was responsible for all the products, my teams were much more longer lived. The infrastructure and operations tribe and later alliance, their teams are actually very dynamic. Their teams are constantly they would form teams, dissolve teams, form teams, dissolve teams. My teams were much longer lived because they were doing things like owning search, and search is never done. But we could both be coexisting and working well together because of the way the model worked. Now, that doesn't mean that it was a panacea, because it wasn't. There was lots of stuff that didn't work. And if you've seen Henrik Nieberg's videos, as I said, I helped him with that, because at that point I was giving talks about Spotify, and I'll talk about why we did do that. And people would come up to me and they go, "Yeah, it can't be. It's not as perfect. You're making this up. Clearly, the reality isn't the case." And no, it actually worked exceptionally well. But there were things that this model was not designed for and did not do well. Big projects, for those of you who work in enterprises and you deal sometimes with these kind of large scale kind of projects. I certainly did when I worked at like Microsoft or Adobe. Spotify, with all these autonomous teams, each doing their own thing, yeah, those didn't work at all. Those were really hard, because each of these teams would say, well, no, we're not doing your thing. We're doing what we do. Like a joke we had in the senior tech leadership, because we'd hear this from people, would be, why do you hate squad autonomy? That was like, if we ever said anything that felt like we were compromising squad autonomy, we'd hear that from the teams. So that kind of coordination you need to do when you're doing a large project doesn't work great when you have all these truly autonomous teams that don't want to be told what to do, because that's not how they work. We didn't have a project management function. That just didn't exist. And because of that, when you have like a big project, how do you coordinate a big project if you don't have any project managers? We created a temporary role called road manager, I'll talk about in a minute, to be sort of a project manager. But we didn't have anybody that was actually trained or did that as a job, which meant that execution was pretty bad on these kind of large projects. And we would get into some anti-patterns sometimes. If we had a contractual agreement with another company that required a delivery on a date, which every company does, we would sometimes get into this place where we would act very much against our own nature and take away squad autonomy, because we needed to coordinate a bunch of teams together to deliver together. And that always killed morale. There was solutions to that. We did have ways of addressing it. One was, again, one of the things that's great about Spotify was a true culture of continuous improvement. I'm going to talk a lot more about that, which meant that there was, being also a very agile company, we not only did the kind of normal team level retrospectives, but we had a really great practice of project level retrospectives. So anytime there was any sort of significant project that touched any sort of thing, we would always have a retrospective. So I remember when I joined Spotify, one of the first things that happened one of the first projects that happened after I joined it, I don't even think it was just my team, my tribe, but it also touched some of the other teams we worked with a lot, like licensing and those kinds of things. And it was one of the what we called blacklist artists who didn't want their music shared on Spotify. I don't remember while I was there. We did Led Zeppelin and we did the Beatles and we did Pink Floyd. I think it might have been Pink Floyd actually. Um, I think that was the time. I think that's right. So we got them. They had agreed to finally be on streaming services. So we launched Pink Floyd on the platform, and it was like it was a hugely successful project. The band was happy, the fans were happy, the label was happy. It was just it went off without a hitch. And I was really surprised to find, like, a couple days later, a 4-hour retrospective on this project that I thought, like, had gone exceedingly well. Why would you have a retrospective on a successful project? It went great. And what I found was we spent 4 hours talking about all the things we had done that we probably should have done differently or done better. We were very self-reflective. We were very open to acknowledging what are the things that we did that did well and what are the things we could do better next time. That culture of project retrospectives meant when I was later a road manager for the largest project Spotify had ever done to that point, including hundreds and hundreds of developers, almost the entire development team, and a big chunk of the rest of the company, I had this massive library of these project retrospectives, because all of them were public, that I could refer to. And I could learn about every project, what we had done wrong and what had gone well, so that when it was time for me to lead this really big project, I actually had a lot of knowledge that I could bring to it. Essentially, I got to steal a bunch of experience from everyone who'd done one of these projects before me, which meant that I got to not make any of their mistakes. The project went very well. I got to make completely new mistakes and then share those later in multi-day retrospectives. We also got better at just picking road managers. I had, coming from these bigger companies, leadership roles, I was kind of used to the things you need to do to run a successful project. There were other people like me who had prior experience kind of as not necessarily project managers, but certainly had experience executing projects. So we got better at finding the people who actually knew this stuff at least enough to do it well, and then making them road managers instead of just choosing random people within the organization. Strategic alignment, obviously, if you're very bottom up because you have these autonomous teams, each driving towards their own goals, a strategic alignment is difficult. We had a way, and if you watch the videos that Henrik did, he talks about aligned autonomy, which to me always, like to him too, it feels kind of weasel words. We made fun of that phrase, but it was it was what we were trying to achieve. Now, when I describe the process we had around aligned autonomy, and it's in the videos, and there's a white paper from CRISP that also talks about some of this stuff. I should be clear, by the way, like, because Henrik did it in the videos and wrote the white paper. Henrik didn't invent this. It actually came from, we had a tech operations team that actually invented the process, but they didn't feel like blogging about it. So they didn't. Henrik did. So he gets credit with this a lot, or I get credit with stuff like that neither of us had anything to do with. And he is very open about what he did and didn't do. And I'll tell you, I didn't invent these things either. But I'm sharing them with you because they were incredibly instructive to me. One of the things we did as part of this aligned autonomy was we created this decision-making document, very much influenced by things like the Toyota A3 document and other things like that, these kind of single-page decision-making documents. Ours was called DIBS. It stood for Data, Insights, Beliefs, and Bets. The important part was that it was a data-driven decision-making structure that ended up that articulated a hypothesis and then had a series of bets that would validate or invalidate the hypothesis. That created kind of a set of potential projects, bets that we wanted to execute. There was a strategy team that I was part of, as well as other senior tech leaders, senior product folks, some biz dev folks. It was kind of a company level strategy team, and we would meet twice a quarter to go through a set of proposed bets that we wanted to execute on. We would do very, very strict priority ordering, 1 through sometimes up to 70 of these projects, and then they would get published. We tried to whip limit it. I can talk a lot about trying to get senior leaders to do any sort of whip limiting. but sometimes we would be a little bit better. But with this list and all the DIB documents that came with it were shared with the entire organization in a very transparent way. And every squad would go and look at this list and say, is there something that we can do that would move this bet forward or participate in it? And then they would choose to engage around supporting that bet. So it became a sort of way to broadcast strategy, broadcast the things that we as senior leadership wanted the company to work on, and then teams would align themselves to it. If you're from, there's, again, Spotify didn't invent this, like Stephen Covey talks about it. Since then, there's been like the EOS stuff. There's lots of people that do this. The way Spotify did it in a very data-driven way, I really appreciated. And it worked fairly well as a way of not robbing squads of their autonomy, but also aligning around a strategic direction. Growing senior leaders was very difficult. So I came in as a tribe lead, having been a director and managed large engineering organizations at other companies. When it came time for me to become an alliance lead and hire tribe leads, we did this across the organization. So all of a sudden we were hiring across the organization a bunch of tribe leads. What we found was there was a big gap. As a tribe lead, I had both people management, strategy, and delivery I was, the single ringable neck. The chapter leads that reported to me, the line managers, they had people management, they had personal development, professional development for the people in their chapter, but they weren't responsible for delivery. They weren't responsible for strategy. They were part of squads. And so they were part of these really consensus-driven teams, which meant that there was a big gap. If they hadn't done this role externally prior to coming to Spotify, they had no understanding. Like, I would interview them and you would ask them, oh, you have to make a hard decision. I had to make decisions all the time as a senior leader. You have to make a decision. What do you do? And they would say, well, I go and talk to these people and we decide together. And I said, nope, you have to make a decision the next hour. This important thing is going on. You need to make a decision. How would you do it? And they literally didn't know how to make a decision without kind of involving a group of people. And that was a bit of a problem when you're asking somebody to essentially take on responsibility over sort of millions of euros, and a very fast moving business. So I ended up I ended up finding good tribe leads, but they were all people who'd been essentially very senior leaders in companies prior to coming to Spotify. And the third tribe lead I had to hire externally because I couldn't find, even of these really senior chapter leads I really liked, they just weren't ready for this level of responsibility. It was a gap in the model. So I would love to tell you about this great thing we did, but in the short term, while I was there, we created a leadership training program. I think we could have done a lot more around that, but this did work, and it has produced tribe leads since then. Resource efficiency. And when I say resource, I mean resources, but I also mean people. I'm grouping them together. I'm not calling resources, don't mean people, just being clear about that. But it includes everything the team needs. Spotify was a blitz scaling company. So that meant as I said, we were doubling, tripling. If you want your squads to be truly autonomous, meaning they don't have any dependencies on any other team, functional or otherwise, you need to have every possible function represented in that team that the team could need, whether they need to be fully engaged at all times or not. And so that meant that those teams were massively overstaffed. Like, all my teams were what you might consider, if you were in a more kind of staffing constrained company, you would say, I can't believe the number of people you have. And that would be what I said about my own team. When my team would complain about lack of headcount or something like that, I would point out that my tribe, music player tribe, when we were about 80 people, we were bigger in the tribe, just being part of a much larger company than almost all the companies in streaming music. We were bigger than Rhapsody, we were bigger than Deezer. My tribe was, and that was the entirety of those companies. And by the time I left, where my team was about 180, 200 people, at that point we were bigger than several of those companies put together. but I would still hear about how resource constrained the teams were, either or specifically around headcount, because they only had one iOS developer, or they only had, this or that, and they were constantly needing more people because they were finding they were having to wait for things. That also meant, because people wouldn't sit around if they didn't have anything to do, or if they didn't have anything to do immediately, they would work on stuff, and they didn't always work on the most important things, but they wanted to contribute, which meant, especially because these teams were very much isolated from each other by design, they would get really insular and they get really navel gazy, and they'd start working on stuff that wasn't really that useful, while there might have been bigger things going beyond that. And the chapter leads and tribe leads would be watching for this and trying to help ameliorate those problems, but teams could get really focused on solving their own problems when they had this kind of excess capacity, as opposed to, because they could just solve problems for themselves all the time, they'd lose that aspect of what the biggest priorities for the tribe were, things like that. But if you really want to be able to do that kind of blitz scaling model, there's really only one way to do it, which is to raise lots and lots of money, which Spotify did, up into $1 billion rounds towards 2015, 2016. So that's one of the reasons why a lot of companies that have tried to adopt the Spotify model have failed spectacularly sometimes, because they either don't get this, so they try and introduce it into a staffing or resource constrained environment. Doesn't work that way. Was never meant to work that way. Or a very common thing is again, because we didn't give them maybe enough information about how to do it well, they would also not really understand what true team autonomy was, and they wouldn't know how to actually give teams full decision-making power. Another thing, and this I don't think we talked about nearly enough, any of us from Spotify, one of the things that happened is Spotify's culture. When you talk about the Spotify model, that was really product engineering. In fact, one of the things I saw when I would visit other companies that was interesting, companies who tried to copy us, would be that they got it wrong, because we didn't say this was just product engineering. So they would actually apply it to the whole company and I would call that, they'd get it wrong, but they'd actually end up doing it better than we did. So there was a company I visited in Munich called Stylight, and Stylight had read our white paper and decided to do their company that way, the founders, and had created a legal squad and an HR squad and a marketing squad, and those squads had developers in them. They were true cross-functional teams, and now they'd taken our model way past what we were doing and done it better in a lot of ways. It didn't matter when I joined that this was mostly product engineering, because most of the original product owners were developers that became product owners in the model. So they were very comfortable with the way of working. And the engineering team, especially when I joined, was most of the company was the engineering team. So we had the ability to kind of pull the rest of the company along with us. They didn't really have a lot of choices. But as the company grew, and finance became its own sort of center of mass, and sales and marketing, as these teams grew, and especially as they were able to hire from other companies and product as well. So instead of getting developers becoming product owners, they could go hire product managers from YouTube and BBC and other major companies who came to Spotify not to work in the Spotify model. They came to Spotify because Spotify was a major streaming music company, and they had very little interest in the Spotify model. And marketing could care less about the Spotify model. So over time, that created increasing amounts of friction within product engineering, from the product team to the engineering team, but also from the finance team that didn't understand this and didn't care, HR teams, those kinds of things. That created a lot of pressure back on that model. And if you look and see how Spotify's changed since that time, a lot of those changes haven't been because of problems in the way the engineering team is structured, but really in the way the engineering team interfaced with all the other teams. So, that was one of the problems. And I think that was actually one of the failures of my era of that tech leadership group, was that we saw that happening. We knew it was happening. We tried to address it, but we didn't do a good job of trying to address that problem. So all of that said, I think the important part isn't necessarily the model, that squad, tribe, guild, blah model. That wasn't the important thing. And that's not what I took from Spotify. it was the culture that supported that model. That model was tied to the culture that created it. That model was a solution for the culture and how the culture wanted, the culture that product engineering group, how that group wanted to be, to exist. The important parts of that, now you'll hear me say this, you heard me say this before, but if you work with me, you'll hear me say this all the time. Being very thoughtful about the decisions you want to make. And for all of you who are agile professionals, of course, you're going to be thoughtful. You're not going to be random in the decisions you make. But I can tell you so many companies, including major companies, IBM and Silicon Graphics and Microsoft and Adobe that I've worked in, where they weren't really thoughtful about some of the decisions they were making. They thought it through a little bit, but they hadn't really thought it through a lot. Me as a senior engineering leader at the company, I could do whatever I wanted. I was autonomous in my organization, but I would be constantly asked by the people that worked for me or by my peers, "Oh, why are you doing that?" And I'd be, "Oh, that we were thinking we could try this." And they'd say, "Okay, well, why?" And they'd want to know, like, how do you know it's going to work? Especially the folks within my own organization. Not even how do you know it's going to work, but how are you going to test it? How are you going to know if it is working? How are you going to know if it isn't working? What are you going to do if it doesn't work? They wanted to make sure that I'd thought anything through, any kind of program I was putting in or thing I wanted to try. And I would ask the same of them. And that was kind of expected. You were expected to have thought things through. It didn't mean you had to do a ton of preparation or lots and lots of research, but it just meant you had to have a plan, had to have thought it through. And that meant you were also being very deliberate. You wouldn't just do things to do them. So many companies, because I work with through I'm CTO. I forgot to mention this. I'm currently Chief Technology Officer at Anaconda, but I'm also I consult with startups, and I have a consultancy called Nimble Autonomy. And with Nimble Autonomy, I work with lots and lots of early stage or mid stage startups who do things just really reflexively and don't think things through and aren't very deliberate. I really learned, and I was very much that way as a leader. Even if when I was thinking things through, wasn't really deliberate in my decision making. Spotify really taught me to do that just because it was expected, and people would challenge you and make sure that you were thinking how you were going to do them, why you were going to do them. Spotify is by far, I've worked in really good agile companies. I've been doing agile since 1999. So, and only agile. I've only worked agile since then, since we read the XP book at the startup I was at. And what I can tell you is I've been in lots of what I thought were high performing agile organizations. They weren't, not compared to Spotify. Spotify was agile first in a true, like we weren't thinking about agile, capital A agile. We were agile from the culture. And all these things I'm talking about would seem very familiar, autonomous teams, all those kind of things. That's just how we thought. And I really took my own agile practices, really came to another level. And that was also awesome because we were kind of known for that as well. Like you'd have Mary and Tom would stop by, the Pomendicks would stop by, or Jeff Sutherland would stop by when they were in the region because they'd want to kind of visit and talk to us, which meant that gave us a lot of insight into some of the ways that they approach things. So we had that aspect as well. If you looked at individual squads, each of the squads was kind of doing their own thing, which I would argue is fairly agile. Again, being very, very thoughtful of it, we kind of mostly did Scrumban or variations on different things with Scrumban. But again, each team was constantly looking and evaluating the way they did things, being very thoughtful about it and evolving their own practices, and because they're autonomous, they could each do that independently. In order to create truly autonomous teams, they have to be able to make good decisions, which means they have to have the right information to make good decisions, which meant that we as an organization were incredibly transparent. Because if I was hoarding information or trying to decide who needed information as opposed to just broadcasting everything I knew with my own interpretation of that for my team so they kind of understood where things were in the context of everything that was going on. If I didn't do that, they wouldn't make good decisions. And if they couldn't make good decisions, I couldn't trust them to make good decisions. If I couldn't trust them to make good decisions, I would need them to vet their decisions with me, and then I would become a decision-making bottleneck. And that was absolutely not done. So the only way to do that would be to be a truly transparent organization. And as I said, if you're building an autonomous team culture, you are by definition bottom up. It can't really do that in a very top-down way. That notion of being very agile first, this kind of constant understanding of retrospectives and looking and evaluating and being autonomous meant that each of these teams was continually evolving their practices. Each of the tribes were evolving their practices. Each of the alliances were evolving their practices. The guilds, the chapters would help kind of best practices emerge, and then teams could learn about how they were helping other teams adopt them and then continue to iterate on them. That meant that we were, as an organization, we were just continuously improving. Again, I've never been in an organization that did this as well, certainly not before. And I've struggled to kind of bring this level to any organization I'm in to that level, but it's a lot of work. Spotify just built that in early, and it made a huge difference to the company. It's one of the reasons I think the company is so successful still. So there's all these ideas, and I'm realizing I talked a little bit more on the first half than I want to, but I do want to tell you about how I've adopted some of these ideas. And it's very specific, like case study ways. So the first company I worked at after Spotify was Avvo. At Avvo, which Ron visited, and he said, well, you're kind of doing Spotify. And to me, I'm like, well, some of the core parts, some of the core ideas are very similar to the Spotify ideas, because I think those are great ideas. The structure is a little bit different. So we were not a unlimited blitzscaling kind of company. We were very much more of a startup that had kind of people hiring constraints and budget constraints. And so we couldn't build this kind of fully autonomous squad kind of thing. And also, having just done that, the last thing I wanted to do is try and cargo cult this company. I'd told people for years, don't cargo cult us, steal the ideas. So that's what I did. I stole the ideas. So I knew I wanted to build an autonomous team structure. I also knew I couldn't do it by like completely like hiring because I didn't have that kind of money. So instead, what we did, we formed ourselves a little bit about a different structure. Ours was built around journeys, customer journeys. The design team at Avvo was really advanced, really awesome. They'd started building customer journeys around problems to be solved by our different customers. Avvo is a legal marketplace. So we had that as kind of the organizational kind of missions that these teams would be, and we formed teams around them. We formed 6 journey teams. Each of them was between 15 and 30 people, way too small to be a Spotify tribe, but big enough that they had some of that fluidity. Those teams would be very dynamic within them. They would form up little teams to work on like a single set of epics, for example. And when those epics were done, the team would dissolve and a new team would get together. So that meant that they had some of that long longevity because they were working together, and it was a relatively small group of people, but they had some of that level of dynamism. Those teams were truly cross-functional, and I'll talk about even how more cross-functional they were than Spotify teams after. So I wanted some of that level of dynamism and that kind of structure. I also wanted those teams to be autonomous because I wanted them to go fast for the same reasons. Originally, my intent was actually not to create like a chapter model. I actually wanted an engineering manager to be on each of those journey teams to manage the people in that team. When we came time to, we did a self-selection exercise where we allowed all the people to choose their journey teams because we were moving from one structure to another. We asked them, do you want to keep your manager? I didn't want to tell them, well, this is the way I want to do it, so you have to do it this way. I said, do you want to keep your manager, or do you want to, work for this new person? And they actually fairly universally said, we want to keep our manager. So I ended up backing up into chapters. I didn't mean to, but I also didn't want to tell people you don't get to keep your manager if I didn't need to make that. And the managers were fine with that. Each of those journey teams, though, had a manager, an engineering manager, a product manager that were responsible for that. And because they were much smaller than a tribe, it was expected that they were a little bit more hands-on than I was as a tribe lead because the autonomous team unit was not these little teams in journey team. It was the journey team itself. So it's a little bit different, influenced obviously by a lot of the same ideas because I just come out of Spotify. And in fact, actually, there was 2 journey teams that actually had all the people in that journey team reported to that engineering manager, and that worked. Honestly, that worked fine. We just didn't enforce it. We didn't make it happen. And if you haven't seen a journey map, these are one of the journey maps we produced. The design team at Avvo shared a lot of the work they did. It was actually quite cool. We aligned autonomy. So I joined Avvo. Avvo had been around for a little while, but like many startups I work with, the senior leadership team had never figured out how to whip limit themselves. And so what that meant was, like, each person on the senior leadership team was feeding into the engineering teams, giving them work to do. And the engineering teams were stuck trying to figure out, okay, do I do what the chief marketing officer says, or the chief product officer, or the chief technology officer? Like, everyone's giving them work, and they were having to figure out what was important. So sat the senior leadership team down, forced them to do this stack, like this explicitly ordered priority exercise. Unlike at Spotify, I was able to get them to actually whip limit it. And actually, the first time we did it, I think they said, oh, we have to do 7. We can't get it down. I would start at like 30, got it down to 7. Said we can't do any less than 7 or the company will never survive. So we picked up 7. We ended up doing 4. And after that, they said, okay, that's fine. We'll do 2 or 3 per quarter. And it worked out a lot better. But it was very much kind of organized in a very similar way. We would set strategy for the year, do quarterly kind of things that led up into that strategy. The teams align themselves to that kind of published priority list, very similar to what Spotify does or other things you're probably familiar with. That data-driven decision-making, there are lots of decision-making frameworks. The way Spotify did that was really deeply data-driven, actually helped inform a lot of the other things around Spotify culture. So I brought that. I just stole dibs. We renamed it because it's good to do that for some employer branding. So we called ours Dubs because we're in Seattle. So UW is here. So we called ours Dubs, Data Understanding Hypotheses and Bets. I did do an iteration on that. One of the things I found about those DIB documents is, just like those retrospectives, was they were a great resource for understanding why we do things. If you've ever joined an organization and you ask, why do we do this? Like, why do we do this way? And people either tell you, well, this is the way we've always done it, or they tell you, we tried it some other way and it didn't work, so this is the way we do it. And you go, oh, well, what did you try? I don't know, it was before my time, right? You get that kind of thing. These DUB or DIB documents actually say, this is what we tried. These are the things we tried. This is the data we use to inform our decision. This is the stuff we tried, and I added results. These are the results of those bets that we ran, and this is why we do it this way. So, which means that if you come later to the organization, you can look at that and you go, oh, well, your data has changed. The state of the world has changed, and maybe now you can try this other idea again. Or, well, actually, this bet you did, well, that's maybe not the greatest bet. And you can actually think about those things, or you can look at it and go, oh, I get it. This is why you do it. That's much better than just kind of the hearsay that you tend to get in organizations. Creating that culture of continuous improvement, that really was, when people ask me, like, what's the core of Spotify? It's that. It's not the Spotify model. Spotify model is an artifact of that culture. That's been a challenge in every company. That's been my ultimate goal in every company that I work in, is to try and bring that. I think the closest I came was at Avvo. We really got to a really good place there before we got bought. We were so successful, we got bought. New owners, very traditional story. New owners had no interest in any of that stuff. I have been at Anaconda now 8 months, and I'm working very much towards that. It's that starting with that kind of retrospectives, bringing that outside the engineering team, bringing that to the larger company. That's the way I start it. That's the way I always get it started. So if I have Agile coaches, then they'll help me facilitate. Otherwise, I'll just facilitate it myself as CTO, just to teach people the practice. And I've found that after doing that for a couple of different projects, people can usually pick up how to facilitate that. And they'll either use like one of the facilitation methods you can find online, or they'll just steal one of the ones I use, which is fine. And they start doing this themselves because they just find it really generally useful, especially if you do them for all projects. So it's not just like a post-mortem type of thing. It's not a blame exercise. So, and then as you build up library, that also becomes really valuable. So that's usually the way I start it. Being very values driven. So I talked a little bit about this, but probably not as much as I should have. Spotify, those characteristics of Spotify was very cognizant of them, very aware of them. If you're, a lot of you in enterprises, like I've been in enterprises, you get the values are written on a wall, or they're given to you as on a sheet when you get hired. And you can, if their company is relatively bright, maybe they'll test you on them at some level when you interview. But I've been in a lot of companies where I would see those values written on the wall and they would have no meaning relative to my day to day. Spotify, they absolutely were. Everything came from the values. So part of that for me has been, in a lot of companies I'm in, whatever the company thinks are the values are usually, if they came from HR, they came from some other group, usually not the real values. So a process of discovering what the true values of the organization are, and then structuring everything else around those values to maintain them as the company grows, hiring, promotions, all those kinds of things, bonuses, salaries, whatever, making sure they all come from there. And I'm aware of time, so I want to give a lot of time for questions. We're getting reasonably close here to question time. Hypothesis driven product development, I call it that, but you'd call it lean startup. Very much influenced. Spotify did that exceptionally well. I think the only other company I've seen do it quite as well as maybe booking.com in the Netherlands. Really took not only the aspects of kind of lean approaches, but the other part of it, which was the DevOps pieces that you need to also do in order to enable that, and brought that all together to enable teams to do lots of high-speed experimentation and learning from the experiments they put into the market. And avoiding, the one thing I learned from my experience at Spotify and saw other companies that I said did it wrong, is avoiding those cultural silos. So again, at Avvo, I thought we did that exceptionally well. Those journey teams, two of those journey teams were really inwardly focused. They were supporting parts of the business, rather than have that be an isolated engineering team sitting with the rest of technology. Those developers sat with the function they were part of. So there were engineers sitting with finance, there were marketing people sitting with engineering. And that helped we had salespeople sitting with a team that was really working very closely with them. And that's kind of an obvious kind of cross-functional thing to do, but a lot of engineering groups don't do it that way. And what that ended up doing was that that sort of taught our agile engineering practices to those other functions, just exposed that to them in a way that I'd seen at Stylight. But it also exposed the developers to understanding the business better and being closer to their customer, which is a good agile practice as well. And so that ended up meaning, like, we just as we taught dibs or dubs to the whole organization, it also meant that we were doing other things where we were teaching the organization how engineering worked, why engineering worked in that way. They picked up some of the practices, not like they all switched to Kanban boards or something, but they at least started picking up things like retrospectives and finding the value in some of those agile practices as it related to their work. And it also made us not be these weird people over here with our weird boards and stand-up meetings. It made it so that everybody kind of understood that and made it a little bit less foreign, which meant that when I went to the CFO and said, hey, started talking about things like agile budgeting, she understood at some level why I was talking about that. And we were able to find some common ground where it made it a little bit easier for me and my teams. So I want to leave you, before we do some questions, there's some final thoughts I just want to leave you for anybody that's been interested in that Spotify model or thought about Spotify. One of the reasons why I told people don't copy the Spotify model was, I moved to Sweden to work at Spotify. I didn't work at Spotify from Seattle. That model of super flat hierarchy and no leader teams was really well matched to Swedish culture. So I lived in Sweden for 3 years. Swedish culture is very much a we are all the same kind of culture. It is the law of Jante, if you've heard of it, which is basically everybody's the same. Like, we don't care who you are, you're no better than me. That works great if you want to have collective action and you want people to work collectively. Doesn't work so well if you're not in Sweden, and that's one of the things a lot of companies struggled with, or they tried to create these in cultures that didn't work that way. Spotify even had like the teams that worked for me in the US, because I managed teams primarily in Stockholm, but I also the Gothenburg office reported to me, and then later teams in New York and Boston. The teams in New York and Boston were not so into this idea of like, hey, we're all the same. That's not Americans. That's not the American culture. And even as Spotify, was hiring more from like France and Spain and different kind of cultures, that was a little bit challenged. But Spotify was very good at identifying that and kind of bringing them into the culture. The other thing that people also kind of don't understand, because there were a lot of people like myself that's from Spotify that talked about the Spotify model or wrote about it. um, Spotify could care less whether you use the Spotify model or not. Spotify doesn't sell. Spotify's not like Deloitte or something. It was selling that model. Um, the model, the thing is, I talked about Spotify model because I was recruiting. That was recruiting for me. That was employer branding. The agile coaches, a lot of them wanted to share knowledge of the kind of work they were doing, or to be honest, they liked being flown around the world to talk about the Spotify model at these agile conferences all over the world. That was part of it too. So Spotify could care less. And actually, by the way, one of the reasons why you don't see anybody from Spotify talking about the Spotify model anymore is because Spotify got a little tired of having half of its agile coaches out of the buildings at any point in time, because they'd be in like Paris or South Africa speaking about the Spotify model. That wasn't really that valuable to the company. The other part is when you see if you read the Henricks and Anders white paper or the videos, or you see my talk, or you see somebody like Cliff Hazel's talk, or Jimmy Janlin, or Victor Cezanne, whenever any of us talked about it, we all worked in, actually, well, some of them worked for me, but not all of them were for me. What they would talk about and what I would talk about, even though we were talking about the same thing, we worked in the same place, we worked in different tribes. Our tribes worked differently. And so you'd end up hearing is sort of little captures, little photographs of moments in time of a specific environment that didn't always match up because each tribe worked differently, each squad worked differently. The model was really fluid, and we never really gave companies enough information for them to really know how to copy it. I think the one company that's kind of well known for copying the Spotify model at scale is ING. ING did a massive kind of copy of the Spotify model. But when they did that, like I spent a couple days there, a lot of the agile coaches would spend like a week there. They came over and spent a ton of time. They didn't just look at the blog posts, like they spent a lot of time with us trying to understand that model before they applied it. The other thing, like I think as Ron may have said, but certainly I would say, like, we didn't invent most of these practices. Most of these practices are either good agile practices, predated Spotify, or were in use in other parts of the industry. Matrix management has been around for forever. But Spotify was incredibly curious and open and liked sharing. I spent a lot of my time visiting other companies that weren't doing Spotify, that were doing other things that were interesting. I was constantly on the lookout to find other companies wherever they were in the world that were doing kind of cool things, and then visiting them and then seeing what they were doing, and they would come and visit us. We would do things like we would do shared. Somebody would go work at some other company for 6 months, and somebody from that company would work with us. We were incredibly curious and interested and open to find out new ideas and hungry for them, and would share them. And as I said, like each team was autonomous, which meant they were each their own like little laboratory, and which meant that squad to squad, tribe to tribe, stuff was really inconsistent. That worked great in that model. And as new practices would emerge, there would always be adopted, because we were very thoughtful and very data driven about how and why we would adopt them. But to be clear, though, Spotify wasn't super precious about any of the things we did. Every quarter in the senior technology leadership, we go for a couple-day offsite where we talk about kind of things going on in the organization. And almost every time we would talk about, is the Spotify model done? Are we reaching the limits of scaling? Should we be doing something else? When we decided we would reach that level of horizontal scaling, that just wasn't working for us anymore, we couldn't keep scaling horizontally, we spent about 6 months looking at every possible other way to solve that problem besides adding another layer of hierarchy. We spent we spent a couple days with the sociocracy people. We talked to tons of different companies about ways that they were scaling in a really agile way. Just try and find, is there a better way we could do this other than just the obvious thing, which is adding another layer. In the end, we ended up coming back to that because it is an obvious thing, and none of the other ways we thought were going to work with us or scale. We also understood, though, when we adopted another layer of hierarchy, we knew about how long it would scale for. So that was we were very thoughtful about it. We knew, okay, we think this will get us maybe about another 3x of scale before we think this will maybe start to fail again, at which point we'll have to reevaluate it. And that is more or less kind of what has happened. It reached that next level of scale, and then they've done the next thing. They just haven't talked about it anymore because they like having their employees actually working in the building instead of visiting conferences. So I'm going to leave you with my kind of final thought. The true agile, Spotify's true agile and cultural and scaling innovation was building that culture of learning that I talked about, and continuous improvement, and not only hiring, being really careful around hiring for values around that, but then bringing people in and inculcating in them in that culture, making them part of that culture. And that's everything else came from there. So that's been the core of what I've learned from Spotify and how I apply what I've learned in the companies I've been at since then. So I'm happy to take questions forever. But if you think of a question later, this is how to reach me on Twitter or various websites, and very happy to take questions now if you have them. And I can't see anybody because I'm all right, let me stop because I'm sharing, so I'll stop sharing.
Yeah, so this is Jay. So there's not that many people, there's like 39 people here. So just if you have a question, just open up your mic and go ahead and ask.
So Kevin, you had people changing back and forth among teams.
Yeah.
And teams are very dynamic, but with that chapter notion, you had people didn't have to change managers in order to change back and forth among teams. Did people change from tribe to tribe, or were most people mostly circulating within their own tribe?
Mostly circulating in their own tribe. You could move tribe to tribe. That was understood that tribe to tribe would mean you'd switch managers. But usually the tribes were big enough that you didn't necessarily need to do that unless you really wanted to do something different.
So part of my question is, so Ron Quartel talked about reforming teams every 2 days with this fast agile.
Yeah.
M. Campbell Pretty talks about building teamwork at the tribe level in her book Tribal Unity. Do you feel like what you did at Spotify and what you've done since then is building that teamwork at the tribe level, and that's part of what enables that fluidity?
Sorry, I realized I was been in shadow, so I was fixing that. So sorry, repeat your question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so fast agile, M. Campbell Pretty,
Yeah.
and Tribal Unity, that sort of notion that we've got teamwork at the tribe level, which instead of having teamwork at the team level, where we're sort of locked into our team, but that tribe level is intriguing to me.
That's basically kind of what we were doing at Avvo with journey teams. So that really was, the work happened at the journey team level. It was smaller. I think I liked the fast agile and I like the Tribal Unity book. I would say though, at the scales we were and the scales we were growing, very quickly, most of the tribes were over 100 people, and oftentimes the tribes were split across multiple sites as well. So I think those would struggle, but at that smaller kind of tribe size, at 30, 40 people size that we had at Avvo, I think that would work. That was kind of the way we organized it. Did that answer your question? There's somebody with an open mic. Other questions?
Hey, Kevin, I discovered a Spotify model for myself a few years ago because I had dominating managers on a team. And for me, an idea of a chapter was like
Yeah.
a solution for that. I could take a manager and put him in charge of a chapter. This way, he was not messing up with the team, but on the other hand, still could contribute as a technical expert and a coach for the team.
Yeah.
But what you said about your model in Avvo, you actually brought a manager back to the team.
Yes.
And that actually made me scratch my head.
So part of the reason I did, I think, was because, Avvo is a team in Seattle. Realistically, maybe it's probably my own bias because I came up through organizations as, a senior developer, then a lead, then a manager, and kind of spent a lot of my career getting to the point where I am today. While I did appreciate that very much about the teams at Spotify, what I also knew was, again, like that was very tied to the Swedish culture that struggled a little bit more in the American Spotify teams, where they were less comfortable with this idea of we're all equal. And so that it was a bit of a challenge for Spotify US teams. We did figure it out, but it was always a little bit uncomfortable for folks there. So one, I like the idea of managers. I like the idea of people having responsibility not only for technical decisions or the technical tiebreaker more than driving technical decisions into the team. And I like having somebody with the team that's participating, has ability to grow and develop people. So not so much, I'm not a huge fan of the manager kind of pushing work down into the team. I very much appreciate though the idea of like somebody there to break the ties and make sure the decisions are getting made and take responsibility around delivery. Like other companies like Zalando did kind of delivery managers. They kind of abstracted some of those things into separate roles. Didn't quite work for them because of a lot of things around that. The people have approached this problem lots of different ways. I just appreciate having this kind of manager person in the team that has not only that kind of personal, professional development for the people that work for them, but also has an accountability and is there to make sure that the team is delivering and to help them through that problem. We kind of abstracted that into multiple people at Spotify, and that worked at Spotify, but I need to find the right company culture and be incredibly careful about who I hired to do that outside of Sweden, I think. So that was part of it.
But how do you manage to get one without another? How do you manage to get a manager who would be able to make decisions, but
Yes.
without pressing work on into the
very, very careful hiring. Very, very careful hiring. Yeah, I mean that's something I still do. Like I don't like, and it's partially I had some micromanaging managers. I had some managers that were ruling the team. I worked in some not great environments. So partially because of my own experience, I'm very careful in how I interview and how I look for folks who can nurture and develop and support, but when it needs to be done, if things aren't happening, they can step into that role. That was the thing that I was missing from those chapter leads who wanted to then become tribe leads. They just didn't know how to do that. So that's an important part for me as well, is in developing senior engineering leadership, is they like without that experience at the line manager level, it's really hard to develop it when you're having to support larger organizations. So that was an aspect of it as well.
Thank you.
I had a
Hey,
question.
Kevin.
Krishna.
Sorry.
So
Yeah.
I think Krishna tried before. So.
Okay, sorry. A quick question, Kevin. So you mentioned a lot about hypothesis-driven development and
Yeah.
alignment from strategy. And I think you also mentioned an A3 kind of an approach.
Yeah.
So how many A3s were needed, or is it just always one A3?
So for the dibs or the dubs, which is, as I said, we're just kind of a rip off of dibs, it would be one per idea, right? So an idea might be, Actually, one of the things that was interesting, and I didn't talk about this, but at Spotify, we'd probably generate 20 or 30 of those DIB documents per quarter, and they'd come up from business development or product leadership advocating for this strategic effort. But those were the only ones who had been trained to do it. At Avvo, we trained everyone to do them. We wanted everyone using this kind of data-driven decision making. We were trying to teach everyone to be very data-driven. And that meant that we were starting to get like, tens of them per month being generated within the organization. So we actually did an experiment where for a quarter, we actually kind of the quarterly goals were crowdsourced from the organization, where we asked people to submit dubs to the senior leadership team, and we would use those dubs to actually build the quarter strategic goals for the company. The problem we had was people were very focused on their particular area. So all the dubs themselves were quite small. They weren't big enough in scale. So we ended up, we still did it, but we ended up creating tranches of kind of similar dubs and turned those into higher level goals, but used all those dubs as resource. And after that, we still would crowdsource them, but us members of senior leadership team would kind of guide some of the development of some of them. But that model, that single page, here's some data. From that data, here's the interpretation of the data. Here's what from that interpretation of the data, here's what we think. This is what we think we should do. And here's the way we're going to test whether that's a good idea. That model, I was really surprised how well people took to it. And after a little bit of training, how good they did it. And a lot of those people, including myself, like did dubs because I still use dibs as a way of making decision making. We are doing something similar now. We're just starting to do something similar at Anaconda, using the PEP, because we're very Python oriented, the PEP framework. But yeah, no, that model worked exceptionally well.
Okay. Sorry, last one. Can I steal the template? I mean, is it publicly available, or is it somewhere?
You can find the dub framework. I gave a talk on, while I was at Avvo, I used to give a talk on building a culture of continuous improvement. There is a dub template in that deck. And I can share that deck's on SlideShare. But the DIB, Henrik Nieberg wrote a blog post on the CRISP website talking about DIBs, and I think he shares the framework there.
Excellent.
Like a template there.
Excellent. Okay.
But honestly, the Toyota A3 template is very easy to find too, and that was a lot of the inspiration for both those frameworks.
Sure. Okay. Thanks a lot.
Sorry, whoever was asking before.
It was me, Donna Gardner.
Oh, hey, Donna.
Hi, I'm curious about professional development of engineering talent. Did you hire mostly mid-level? Did you bring in less experienced, or even straight out of college kind of engineering talent? And did it make a difference which tribe a particular person ended up in terms of their ability to progress, within their own profession?
Very much each tribe had its own kind of spin on stuff. And each tribe lead had their own kind of things that they were looking for in the people that they would develop. I would say Spotify, for me, it's Spotify, before Spotify, after Spotify, I'm always looking at the collective folks who are part of the leadership at different levels. And I'm looking to see, I want balance there. I don't want all senior people. I don't want all junior people. I want a mixture. If I inherit an organization and they've promoted from within, like individuals into managers, I'm going to always go and hire external people with some experience, because I want to build a good community of practice and have people kind of set good examples for each other and learn from each other and build a mentoring culture. And I did that at Spotify as well. So some of the folks would come from external, some would be promoted from within internal. One of the things that Spotify did, it was, again, part of one of the nice things about Sweden. Sweden, it was very, very common, especially because I was managing, I mean, I'm older, but I was managing a bunch of 20 somethings and early 30 somethings. In Sweden, that's when everybody has their kids. And so one of the things we had, because of Swedish laws that now is becoming more common in the US, like the managers would have 6 months of parental leave. So somebody would have a baby and disappear for 6 months, and they would literally disappear. That was great because that gave me an opportunity with maybe individuals that were interested in trying or becoming a manager. That would give me a nice, well-defined 6-month period where they could try the role without consequence. If it doesn't work, that's fine. The manager comes back and they're done. They go back to their old role. So that would give them a chance to try the role, and for a long enough time, they'd actually really get to experience it, have some of the real responsibility. If it went well, if they did well and they enjoyed it, okay, when the next role opened, they would be an obvious person to do it. If it didn't work, that was fine. No harm, no foul. They'd just go back to the role. So I did end up promoting a lot internally at Spotify because of that, because I had people who would step into the role and just do well. But I also hired externally as well, because you do want to have, like I said, a nice mixture of different levels and different levels of experience within any level of an organization. That's just a good, it's good to build diverse teams, including diversity of experience.
Um, uh, earlier the earlier years when I worked at Apple, we had sabbaticals,
Yeah.
and it was a wonderful opportunity for people to try something new without endangering their employment, because the expert would come back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We had those at Adobe. I've missed them ever
Yeah.
since.
Yeah.
And it was a hard thing I left Adobe after 9 years. But I'd always assume I'd stay 10 because I was going to get my second sabbatical, and letting that, not doing that seemed like I couldn't imagine not doing that.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's see, I can look in the chat. Mukesh asked, having the team, he sent that privately, having the teams fluid did not affect the stability part. How did forming norming cycle go through with each of these rearrangements? So within squads, you would have, as I said, like we were conscious of Dunbar's number and the size of the tribe, and we would do things together as a tribe. Yeah, once a quarter, we bring everybody together to, again, encourage kind of information flow from within a tribe. So people did get to know each other, especially within their chapter. And we would also do things like, one of the great benefits of chapter leads is a chapter lead would see across all the squads in the tribe. So if he saw like one squad was having this challenge around iOS, and they knew that in one of the other squads, there was an iOS developer who maybe didn't have a ton of stuff to do right now, they could suggest to that person, hey, do you want to go join this team for a little while and help them get this done, and then you go back to your team. So we would do those kinds of things often. In fact, that was one of the ways I kind of cheated staffing, would be that, so one of the squads had 2 iOS developers, one of the squads had 2 Android developers, one of the squads had an extra backend developer, and that way I encouraged them to kind of do this sharing back and forth across teams. So that meant that people would kind of get to know each other, get to know the other teams, and that made that a little bit easier. But as I said, at Spotify, we didn't like this. I did not have a lot of dynamic squads. Other tribes did, and they would just go and do it like explicit team kind of building exercises. They got really good at trying to get through those cycles a lot faster. At Avvo, within the journey teams, they were small enough that I think they didn't have some of those problems, but they would also do this kind of like explicit stages of that team forming, storming, norming, that whole thing that they would go through to just kind of do their best to speed it up a little bit. Okay, hopefully that answers your question, Mukesh. Shibu, when any member dev QA to join Spotify team, how do they get trained to align to Spotify culture? What are the key attributes training? One of the things that was really critical about the Spotify interview model was that culture interview. So that was it was either going to be me in my tribe or was going to be one of the Agile coaches, no matter how well you did on that and any other part of the interview process, you fail the culture interview, you don't get a job offer. You could fail any other interview, but you could not fail the culture interview. One of the other things we did is when you joined the company, you ended up on a temporary squad. So your first 2 weeks at the company, you were part of a temporary team that would learn the actual process of deploying and all that kind of stuff you need to do, get your GitHub set up, all that stuff. But you'd also go through like a couple weeks with a product manager or product owner from one of the existing squads, with an Agile coach from an existing squad, with a developer that was your buddy that would help everybody get going, but you'd actually build and deploy stuff in the product. And it was great for product owners. They loved being part of the boot camp squads, as we called them, because they could get like an extra whole team of work out while they were sort of product ownering 2 teams at once. So that was actually something that they would compete for. And so that was a great way to kind of learn it and see it in action with like full-time people and people that would become part of your cohort. But what I'll also tell you is that if it was clear to the Agile coach that was working with the team or the product owner or the developer buddy that, hey, we might have made a mistake hiring you, yeah, you wouldn't leave. You would be done at, before the end of those 2 weeks. If we knew that we could sometimes make mistakes, and we would find them and end them. So we did sometimes send people, we would fire them before the end of those 2 weeks. If it was clear, like somehow we'd screwed up in the hiring, because the worst thing we could possibly do is bring in somebody that was going to be antithetical to the kind of culture that we had built. We just didn't need that. It was not going to be helpful for us. So we were pretty careful about those kinds of things. And it didn't happen that often because we were pretty good at hiring, but it did happen. When I was in a boot camp squad, actually what's funny is I was in a boot camp squad with Henrik Nieberg because he had never done it. And so he decided to do it, and just happened to be the one I was in. So he and I worked together on some features at Spotify. But there was somebody that joined, and it's like what this person was just so clearly didn't get what we were doing and had no interest in it. And I had to have a talk with that person's chapter lead and said, this person is really not going to be right for us. You need to take care of this. And they did. You have to be that serious about it if you're going to do it. From Nick, how did software architecture fit into the model? Are you able to afford architecture on every team? We did not. We had one software architect, and his job was unlike any software architect you've probably ever worked with. His name was Mikael Krantz. So he was the chief architect of Spotify. He generated no architecture documents. He dictated no diagrams, none of the kind of traditional architecture stuff. His job was to go visit every squad, or go wander around, sit in on a stand-up, see what people were doing, and if they were doing something he thought was probably a bad idea, he would ask them, hey, why are you doing this way? And if they didn't have a good answer, that was probably not a good thing. You didn't really want to upset MK. You didn't work for him. He couldn't do something, but he would let you know that what you're doing was probably not going to work very well. And he would make sure that your tribe lead would be aware of it, and your tribe lead would take responsibility, or your Agile coach or whomever. So it was very much a pull model, not a push model of software architecture. It is actually the kind of model I've tried to use ever since, because it is a very there wasn't a lot. If you could actually well articulate why you were doing something, it'd be fine. But if you were doing it because you wanted to do it, like Spotify, there was, as I said, there weren't a lot of rules at Spotify. One of them was we wrote in Java. We had some Python systems from earlier, but we wrote in Java, and we made it really easy to build Java systems because Java scaled well, and we'd used Python originally to build Spotify. It didn't scale well, it failed. So every system got rewritten in Java. So if you wanted to do something in Go, or you wanted to do something in Erlang, you could, up to the point where somebody would find out you were doing something in Erlang, and they'd come by and go, why Erlang? And you'd have to be able to rationalize it and explain it in a good way. If you couldn't, you'd find yourself ending up rewriting in Java, partially because not only because of scalability, but also it made fluidity and people switching teams a lot easier. Because what would happen is maybe you would deploy an Erlang service, and then you'd go join some other team, some other person would come in and look at this and go, I don't know Erlang, this is stupid. And they would rewrite your service in Java because everybody in the company knew Java, everyone working backend, for example. So there were those kinds of things as well, but that kind of came, that was maybe Mikhail's one rule, was everything, like Java was the primary language we would write in, based on his experience scaling the platform. I'm going to switch to the live questions. Actually, Anton, because
yes, I think, yeah, carrying on that subject, actually. So
yeah.
Talking about the teams at Spotify being radically autonomous and, thus often lacking resources, such as mobile development, you mentioned, right. I guess, DevOps, maybe sometimes common tooling, and, often probably impacting teams' speed to market. And I guess, as you mentioned, when people moving teams leads to longer onboarding. Where do you see room for improvement here, especially for those smaller teams that are resource constrained, right, in terms of reuse of common approaches, practices, tooling, infrastructure? What can be done to be more efficient?
So I have never been, since leaving Spotify, and probably never will be in an organization that just had the amount of money we had at Spotify. To build these truly autonomous teams. So I've been in organizations that have been challenged that way around hiring. What I have done around this to still try and get as much of that as possible has been to build as best I can reusable components. One area I learned at Spotify prior to Spotify, when I was at Adobe, we built a very large scale photo sharing application called Adobe Revel. That was, and we did it with 2 DevOps people for several million subscribers. And so I was thinking, oh, okay, well, I can do lots of stuff with a very small DevOps team. At Spotify, having been influenced by companies like Amazon and Google, the DevOps team, the infrastructure operations team, was more than 1/3 of the engineering organization. They were twice as big as my team that was building all the products. But what I realized was, because I had such a massive infrastructure, the developers on my team to build on, we also had a massive client infrastructure team. Again, my team was building the product, and the infrastructure teams that were supporting us were more than twice our size, maybe 3 times our size, which seemed very silly to me at the time and a strange choice. But because of that, any backend developer on my team could manage up to 10 or 20 microservices without any sweat whatsoever. And I realized that by having that level of support, my teams could have a much bigger impact than just the people on the team. So that's one of the things I've done, is I have maybe overinvested in the company since around having an infrastructure that enables teams to do more with fewer people. So I build not like Google size or Amazon percentage wise kind of DevOps and infrastructure teams, but bigger than most companies at the size of engineering teams I lead, much bigger than most of those teams would, because I'm trying to give each of my kind of feature development or product development teams a lot more ability to scale. And so that has worked very well. There's other things I've done around, okay, finding a good way to bring in a new capability, data engineering or data science, where you can't just hire, if you have 10 teams, you can't just go and hire 10 data scientists, where you start with a centralized group that's really will go and live with different teams and just kind of build that understanding of that function as you continue to hire into that capability. And then over time, it becomes big enough that you distribute it. So you start centralized and you move distributed. So I do that a lot as well, especially around new functions, is build a team, but really have them focused on living with different teams, and just those teams may have to wait. But they know that when they have that person 100%. So that person will work with them on a project and then move on to another team, and eventually we have enough mass that we can fully distribute. So that's the other kind of pattern I've developed to work in more, hiring constrained environments, and that's worked fairly well. I continue to do it because it's worked now well in multiple companies. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. I have another one, but I'll wait for my turn again.
Okay.
Thank you.
Alexander?
I completely agree with you that hiring a person who is not a cultural match would cause a lot of damage. Learned it hard way. Tell a little bit more about your cultural interview.
It isn't that unusual relative to any other kind of normal. I'm trying to think of the style, the technique of interviewing, very situational kind of interviewing. But for example, for me, I would spend a lot of time to me, it wasn't interesting, like, oh, tell me about your experience, looking at agile understanding. I wouldn't ask about Scrum, or I wouldn't ask about Kanban, or I wouldn't ask about those kinds of things. Instead, I would say, tell me about the best team you were ever on. What was great about that team? Tell me about the worst team you were ever on. What was tough about that team? Tell me about, just give them different, look at sort of what excites them and what excites them and what repels them, and what they enjoy and the kind of thing they do. And it'd be very, you'd find the people who say, oh, what did you like? Oh, you were at this company, maybe even a company not well known for kind of having good agile practices, but you'd find, oh, somebody worked on a team that was really advanced there, and they can tell you about what they really enjoyed was the freedom that that team had, and how they were able to make decisions together, and how they had built kind of in a narrow, small way, a community of either mentoring or community of self-examination and those kinds of things, where you go, okay, like, you'll do well here. We might have to teach you some things, or people who had never done agile before but actually had a very agile mindset, and we'd say, okay, I could see, okay, you're gonna have to learn some stuff, but when you do, you're gonna be excited to be able to work this way. Where you've touched on it in the past, that's really made you happy. This is gonna be a great fit for you. A lot of it, honestly, was that the more you people were obviously in an agile team, right, you don't want somebody that's going to say, oh, I love having a spec, and I love being working against a spec and delivering against spec. Right? There's those kind of general agile interest questions, but you are looking for that autonomy question, not only being able to change and to self-examine and to understand what's good and what you like and what you don't like, and be able to advocate to improve things, but also just being able to be changeable, be open, be not afraid to question, not afraid to challenge. Those are the kinds of people who are very successful at Spotify. And so we just got over time, really, really good at identifying those people. And the other thing I'll say, so another reason why I would go and my peers would go and talk about Spotify all over the place is, if you know what Spotify is doing, that's either going to dramatically appeal to you, or it's going to completely repulse you, right? So over time, people were coming to us because they knew what we were doing and they wanted to be part of it. So that's a place where, that's another thing I took from Spotify, was just the magic of employer branding, right? Which is why, like, when ING, like ING coaches go and talk about Spotify, like their ING stuff, which honestly, they've evolved a lot from Spotify, and they applied it at a much bigger scale than we did. Their tribes were like 500 people. So they did it differently, but they used all our names, they used all our words. And so when they would do it, everybody would be like, whatever, that's just Spotify, you're not doing anything interesting, right? And that would send them back to us.
ING is a different beast. I actually ran into one of their coaches at Agile 2018 and was literally milking her for a few hours. They actually brought a consulting company and this consulting company gave them some guidance.
So you can buy the spot. Yes, Deloitte was selling Spotify for a little while, which was funny to me. But no, I know for a fact because I spent time at Deloitte. I spent time in Amsterdam at ING, along with like various coaches. I had them come. So eventually they may have had help around some of it, but we very much again, like in the spirit of sharing. And to be honest, I think a lot of the coaches liked going to Amsterdam for a week. Would go and spend time at ING. And by the way, like a lot of the coaches I mentioned, some of them are all all consultants now. A lot of them ended up at Crisp, which is where Henrik was. Henrik was never an employee of Spotify. Henrik was always a consultant. So one of the reasons Henrik likes to talk about it is because a consultant, it got him a lot of work.
Ah.
Yeah, I would just like to mention here for those who are interested. So Saul Vanderburden, he was at ING when they did all that. Now he's at Wells Fargo, leading the Agile transformation there. It's going to be very challenging for him to even think about bringing that model there. They're trying, okay? And there's a lot of cool things they're doing, but it's far from that. And then I just want to point out too that ING, when they implemented that model, they basically made everyone, I wouldn't say they fired them, they had to re-interview to get their job. And what happened, I don't know if you know this, Kevin, is they took their eye off the fraud and off thing, and they screwed up and they got fined millions and millions of dollars.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Oh,
So
wow. Okay.
they were focusing on this organizational change, and it was all cool stuff.
Yeah.
But they took their eye off of this fraud, and they got a lot of fraud and auth hits, and they got fined because they weren't following the practices that's so you got to be careful, because a lot of times when we do these transformations and changes, we focus so much on the transfer, and there's so much change that organization can adopt at any point in time before they implode, right? And at the same time, you cannot take your eye off of doing the stuff you got to do from a business perspective, so you're successful and not get in trouble. So I just want to point that out.
I think the thing they did, I think that most impressed me about this was they had that exercise in the stadium, that self-selection exercise at a soccer stadium with like thousands of people, and had them all choose their teams in one day. It was, yeah, they really did some interesting things around it. Yeah, I'm curious. I'll be curious to see where that ends up, how it continues to evolve. Yeah.
Yeah. And then just to let you know that ING, then they were going to do the same thing in Australia, and they said, oh, we're going to implement the SAFe model, and they pulled back on that rather quickly.
Actually, I learned SAFe from Henrik. He worked for Lego for a little while, and after because he was working for Lego and Spotify, so he came back to Stockholm and taught a bunch of us, because he'd never done SAFe, and Lego did it actually fairly well, and so he came back and taught us all SAFe, to like from a skeptic's perspective, which was actually all right. Any respect I have as a sort of a more startup-y agile person around SAFe came from Henrik Nieberg. There was a comment I wanted to address. Oh, okay, yeah. And then Anton, I'll maybe come back to you, but I want to address some of the questions. Does it pose challenge to team autonomy when they see that if they don't make a timely decision, a manager will step in and make it? No, because the manager is part of the team. The manager is not separate from the team. So the manager will help them if they can't decide. The manager will make the decision, because the manager, wants to make sure the team has a bias towards action and doesn't get stuck in trying to collectively agree. That was actually, to be honest, Oscar, the CTO at Spotify, one of the reasons he said he hired me, and he actually hired several of us were Americans at that tribe lead level, was because the Swedes were so consensus driven that they would be happily arguing a decision for weeks and weeks and never make it. Once they did make it, they were all in lockstep and would move very, very, very decisively. But it was taking too long to make decisions. So that's one of the reasons why he was looking in the US for tribe leads, because he needed that more sort of American kind of, we're gonna, like, we can't let this go forever. We got to make a decision. Let's see. Was there any specific format of retrospective used or a standard one of what went well, what needs to be improved? No, like any, most of the time it was facilitated by Agile coaches. And so they had, 1,000 different facilitation techniques, whatever they liked. The one I use and the one I teach, and that's as a sort of non-Agile professional, but more from the kind of technology leadership side, who's done Agile a lot. I really, really, really like the timeline, where you kind of map out the entire project over the timeline. And just because I love how when you have a bunch of different people who've all come at it from their perspective, seeing them argue about the order of things happening over like a 3-month project, and they kind of get to understand each other's perspective, and that leading into that sort of what worked well, what didn't work well, that kind of thing. I've just fallen in love with that, probably too much, but that ends up being the one I use, because that was the one I really just love. I've got somebody Ron knows is starting with us in Anaconda next month. Elise Shapiro from Seattle is joining Anaconda, and I'm looking forward to her as a longtime Agile professional actually helping me come up with more retrospective things. I was never good at drawing ships. Otherwise, I'd do the anchor sails thing. I worked with some really good drawers who are Agile coaches. I believe Agile should never be the goal. It should be the means to achieve the goal of the company's objective. Yeah, totally agree, but I've done it. I've done waterfall at Microsoft. I'm not doing that anymore. I'm going to do Agile till the day I die, or till we come up with something better. I keep waiting, and I know because of the anniversary, there's been all these things like, oh, okay, what's next with Agile, or what have we done? I'm still, when we have something better, I'll happily move to it. But I did waterfall at IBM. I did waterfall at Microsoft. I've done Cowboy at startups. There's a reason why I have been doing Agile for 20 plus 21, 22 years now, and probably will not do anything better until one of you invents something better that we can all move to that works better. Okay, and so I think that's all the questions from the chat. Anton?
Yeah.
The time.
So just on the question of consistency, how do you, with these teams having autonomous goals and development, how do you maintain consistency? And especially two things that bother me: the user experience being consistent for the user, and when things go broken, and you need to find which team is actually responsible for that, and how we arrange to get it fixed. So those 2 points.
User experience is a great one. So if you look at Spotify circa 2013, 2014, you can literally see the squads in the UI. They would implement buttons differently. So different buttons in different parts of the single window, because it was all composited, right? It was feature teams. It was all composited into a single UI on mobile or on desktop or whatever. You could see different teams' buttons work slightly differently, or were drawn slightly differently. So that was actually one of the big things. That was one of the values of having that. Partly we had a new head of design joined right before me, Rochelle King, came out from Netflix. And one of the things she did, we had this, as I said, like you had a more traditional design hierarchy of the designers, and that overlaid the squad. So the designers sat with the squads and they were part of the squads, absolutely. But one of the things she started instituting is like, well, okay, they'd sit with the squads 4 days a week. 1 day a week, they'd all sit together. They had a design area where they'd all sit together, and they would do things like share the designs they were working with so that they could all see them, which then led to very slowly over time, them kind of coming to a more consistent point until we finally created a design or a component library that all the squads would adopt. And it was originally open source within the groups. My teams would all work on it together and share the code together. But over time, there actually became like a development team in the client infrastructure group that actually built the normal kind of there was one Spotify button after that everybody would use. However, I remember at one point they wanted us all to, the head of that group, who is still at Spotify, came to me and said, okay, so the way it's going to work now moving forward, now that the group exists, is if you need a new UI component, you come to us and we'll make it for you. And I said, absolutely not. There's no way in hell we're ever going to agree to that, because now I got to wait for you, in order, a squad has to wait for you to do this for them. So we just said no. And so that would happen would be squads will still create new UI components. I know this is still the case. When they have a truly novel UI problem, and if other squads adopt it, eventually it'll move to that kind of core group. But each squad is still going to do whatever makes sense. They just don't waste time reinventing, buttons and stuff. And there is much more design consistency, because the design team actually talks to each other at least once a week. On the other side that you were asking about, sorry, there was the design side, there was the, what was
reliability, just overall
Reliability.
platform reliability, and if things go broken. Yeah.
Right. So each squad, so each squad is responsible for their systems, and each squad has a tester on the team, if not more than one. They're responsible for their own systems, because they have this really great infrastructure they build on. They have monitoring, they have alerting, all that's kind of built into the frameworks that they use. So all that stuff, they'll get notified when there's an issue, and they're on call. That's one of the things we created while I was there, specifically for my teams, is we moved from an operations model to the squads took ownership over their systems and were responsible for them. So usually within a squad, there wouldn't be enough backend engineers to do a full kind of real on-call rotation. So that would happen within the chapter. So there'd be 7, 8 developers in a chapter. That would become an on-call rotation, which meant that they also had to teach each other their systems, so that when they were on call, they could fix them if something came up, which meant that they were also reviewing PRs for each other, which would help with quality. Because now if you have to wake up your friend, you are much less likely to just go, whatever, I don't care. That was a problem when we had an operations team, is developers just kind of throw stuff over the wall. So that was one of the reasons why we moved to operational responsibility within the squads. On the UI side, those issues, it's funny. No, the teams would feel responsible for the UI, the front end issues. But I remember at one point, because there was a separate client infrastructure team that my team used, their components similar to we do for backend infrastructure. And that was also the team that actually collected all the features and shipped them to Apple or Google. They had decided that we weren't, my team that was really building the product, they decided we weren't being serious enough about quality. They decided, because they could see all the reports from the app stores, that we weren't being serious enough. And this became a point of friction between them and us, because they decided we didn't care enough about quality. So one of the product managers on one of the feature teams said, okay, well, you think this and we think this, we're going to go test it. And what he did is he actually added code into the app that would crash the app deliberately. And then we did a test. We did an A/B test to find out how many times a day that Spotify crashed would it take for you to quit using Spotify. And we rolled it out. So for some period of time, you'd be using Spotify and we would deliberately crash the app on you. And we might do it again 2 or 3 times during the day until we found out how many times a day would it take before most people would cancel their subscriptions and stop using Spotify. And once we had that number, we could say, well, we're below that number, so no, our quality's fine, right? So that was kind of the data-driven approach that Spotify had. That was really valuable. We took quality seriously, but we also had a lot of other things. We had blue-green rollouts on backend systems. We had progressive deploys. Because we were early microservice architecture. When we would do a new version of a service, we would do a new from scratch service. And we would leave the old version of the service running in production until traffic went below some minimum. And so you just have 2 versions and you'd route differently depending on which version of the API you were using. So that let us do lots of stuff where we'd catch quality issues, we never deployed a feature to 100%. We always deployed to, we had enough scale that we could deploy to 1%, then 5%, 10%, 25%, 50%, 75%. So we would also, when we did make mistakes, because we did, we would usually catch these. If we didn't catch them as a canary, we didn't catch them as a blue-green, we would catch them in the progressive deployment. And before it affected a significant percentage of our customers, and we could roll back or roll forward at that decision. We would also test features that way. Every feature was tested that way through a progressive rollout. And if we found an issue at 5%, okay, we'd either stay at 5% and iterate on that percentage of customers until we saw the metrics we were looking for in our hypothesis, or we'd just pull the feature and say, okay, well, it didn't work out, so I guess we won't use this feature. So we were pretty good about those kinds of things. We were not, and I always thought to be honest, I always thought we underinvested. I did agree that we probably were underinvesting in quality. Each team had a tester, but it's one tester in a team of, for my feature teams, up to like 14 people. It's not a great ratio. And compared to like my teams at prior companies, it was really crummy. But given all the other infrastructure we had around things, it actually wasn't a significant problem. I am finding, as a customer of Spotify, since I'm finding a lot of issues in the current desktop app, and I am sending a lot of mail to people because that is really unusual. Like the time, unless I'm in some weird A/B test group, which is possible, I shouldn't be seeing those kind of issues by the time it rolls out to me. So that makes me a little bit concerned around stuff. So I like when you do see issues, because I still use the product all the time. That surprises me, and I usually will reach in to somebody I know that still works there to find out what the heck happened, why I'm seeing that issue.
So Mr. Goldsmith, we are over our allotment in time. So I want to thank you very much. So everything you just said before, one of the things we're going to expose and talk about more, and maybe you can join us and we'll talk more, is how to introduce complexity science and chaos engineering. So what you described before is the perfect example of chaos engineering and how you apply chaos to determine the data to make those kind of decisions, right?
Yeah.
So we're going to explore that more. So come back. So thank you, everyone. Kevin, this was wonderful. I learned a lot from you, probably more than I should. So I want to thank you so much for coming and sharing all this wisdom. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And thank you everyone else for joining. I'll send out the recording soon. I got 2 more I've got to upload. So I'll do 3 and send out to everyone. Kevin, if you want to send
before we log off,
yeah.
Raj Kumar has a position he's hiring for. And asked if he could advertise his position.
Sure.
Raj, are you on? Did we lose him? No, he's still here. And anyone else have positions they want to advertise? They're looking to hire.
Let me just real quick. Let me just say thank you, Jay, and thanks, Ron. I really did appreciate this opportunity to talk to you all. And I'm waiting on one of those recordings because I had to miss that. But yeah, you'll see me in future meetups as long as you do them virtually.
Yeah,
all right, cool.
A ton of thank you to you, Kevin. That was what I was looking for. Sasha.
Guys, we are also hiring. We are looking for enterprise level coach at Bank of the West. To add our team, we have a really good team of coaches. We do have an interesting mix of Spotify and Safe. Don't try to make fun of us. It's actually very interesting. We don't know what's going to happen with that, but we're experimenting. So if you are interested in joining us with these experiments, please ping me on LinkedIn.
Yeah, so Alexander Funkin, just ping him. He's a wonderful gentleman.
Thank you. Here is my LinkedIn profile. We really want to have A+ people to join our team.
No C-?
Well, We'll have a cultural interview.
All right, anyone else want to, who's doing hiring, who wants to share?
Okay, so that's one thing we probably should think about, Ron, is a board or something for, positions and needs and hiring. So we'll think about doing that as we go forward, because we have a YouTube channel. I'll send it and all the recordings, and I'm trying to create, we have a Google slice of life where we put out the presentations and everything. So we're growing up. So I'll send that to everyone, and thank you, Kevin. That was wonderful. Thank you so much. And I'm gonna
We
say,
do have a LinkedIn channel,
oh yes,
and we do have a LinkedIn group and a Slack channel as well.
yeah. Oh my God, we got so much crap. Just join us. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. I'm gonna say goodbye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you, Alexander.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.